Okay, so you think you're smarter than most people. You read one article, watch two videos, learn a few fancy words, and suddenly you feel like you understand the entire subject. But here's the strange part. The less people know about something, the more confident they usually feel about it. And the more someone actually understands a subject, the less certain they often become. Psychologists have a name for this, the Dunning-Kruger Effect. And once you understand it, you might start questioning how much you actually know. In 1999, a psychologist named David Dunning and his graduate student Justin Kruger ran a series of experiments at Cornell University that would change how we think about self-assessment. The setup was elegant in its simplicity. They took a group of undergraduate students and tested them on three things: logical reasoning, grammar, and humor. After completing the tests, they asked each student one question: how well do you think you performed compared to everyone else? The results were extraordinary. The students who scored in the bottom quarter, the ones who performed worst, believed they had scored above average. Not just slightly above average, way above average. They estimated themselves to be in roughly the 62nd percentile. In reality, they were in the 12th. But the finding that surprised people even more was what happened at the other end. The students who scored highest, the ones in the top quarter, actually underestimated their performance. They assumed that because the task felt easy to them, everyone else must have found them easy too. Competence, it turns out, gives you two things: the ability to perform well, and the ability to recognize what performing well actually looks like. Incompetence robs you of both at once. So why does your brain do this? It comes down to a fundamental problem of self-evaluation. To know how much you don't know, you need to know enough to recognize the gaps. But when you're just starting out, you don't yet have the map that shows you where the territory ends. You only see what you've covered. And that feels like a lot. Think about the first time you picked up a guitar. You learned 3 chords in a weekend and felt unstoppable. A week in, you're already imagining performing on stage. Then you watched a professional play. And something shifted. Suddenly, you understood how much you didn't understand. The confidence didn't disappear because you got worse. It retreated because you got better. This is the cruel geometry of learning. The very beginning of acquiring a skill often feels like mastery because you don't yet know what mastery looks like. Dunning called this the peak of Mount Stupid. You've learned enough to feel confident, but not enough to know why you shouldn't be. Dunning and Kruger discovered something else that runs even deeper, something they called the double burden of incompetence. Not only do unskilled people reach wrong conclusions, they also lack the metacognitive ability to realize they've reached wrong conclusions. It's not that they have bad information, it's that their internal instrument for measuring accuracy is broken. You can't use a faulty ruler to measure how faulty the ruler is. They tested this in multiple domains: legal reasoning, medical diagnosis, chess, language learning. Every time the pattern repeated itself, the least skilled participants were the most certain. The most skilled participants were the most likely to say things like, "It depends," and "I might be wrong about this." Expertise, it turns out, looks a lot like uncertainty from the outside, because the expert can see every caveat, every exception, every edge case that the beginner hasn't even discovered yet. Here's what makes this actually dangerous. Think about every confident voice you've ever heard in a meeting room, on a podcast, in a comment section online. Confidence reads as competence. We're wired to follow the person who sounds most certain. It's an ancient instinct. In a crisis, you don't want someone who says, "Well, there are a lot of factors to consider." You want someone who points and says, "that way." But that instinct misleads us constantly in the modern world. The loudest voice in the room is statistically more likely to be near the beginning of their learning curve than the end of it. The person with the most nuanced, qualified, uncertain-sounding answer is often the one who actually knows what they're talking about. This is not just a personal problem, it scales. It explains why industries get disrupted by confident outsiders who don't yet know what the insiders know is impossible. Sometimes that's a good thing. Occasionally, someone who doesn't know the rules genuinely breaks them in a useful way. But far more often, it just produces confident mistakes at a large scale. And here's the part that should make you pause. You are not exempt from this. Dunning himself has written about this. He noted that the effect isn't limited to people with low ability in some absolute sense. It applies to all of us in every domain where we're not yet expert. which means it applies to almost everyone, almost everywhere, almost all the time. You have an area where you know a lot, and in that area, you probably underestimate yourself, and you notice how much is still unknown. But you also have areas where you know just enough to feel confident, and in those areas, statistically, you are likely overestimating yourself right now. The uncomfortable version of this effect isn't those other people are overconfident. It's which areas of my own life am I standing on the peak of Mount Stupid, completely convinced I'm at the summit. There's a way out, and it's almost embarrassingly simple. Dunning's own follow-up research showed that when people were given training, not just in the subject itself, but in how to evaluate their own performance, the overconfidence shrank. The antidote isn't doubt, it's calibration. Learning to ask not, do I know this, but how would I know if I was wrong about this? Actively seeking out people who know more than you, not to feel humbled, but to update your map. Reading criticism of positions you hold, not to abandon them, but to test them. Understanding that I'm not sure from someone who's thought hard about something is worth more than I'm absolutely certain from someone who hasn't. The slope down from the peak of Mount Stupid is not failure, it's progress. The valley of despair that Dunning-Kruger's model describes, that place where you've learned enough to know how little you know, is not a crisis. It's the threshold you have to cross to get to the other side, where real competence lives. Where confidence is quieter but much harder to shake. Think about what this actually means for the decisions you make every day. The opinions you hold firmly, the times you walked into a conversation, certain you were right. The times you dismissed an expert's nuance as overthinking because their answer wasn't simple enough. The most dangerous words in any domain are, I already understand this. Because they close the door before you've had a chance to see how much room was still left in the house. The next time you feel completely sure about something, ask yourself one question. Do I know this well enough to know what would change my mind? If the answer is no, you're probably not standing where you think you are. The summit always looks closer from the bottom. That's not a flaw in the mountain. That's a flaw in the map.